Let me start by saying the big question I've been asking is how can education play a role in responding to the major crises confronting our societies and the world? And for that, I would focus on two issues. One is that education's got to play a role in integrating children into the society as it is, giving them the skills so they can participate fully, but it also has to give them the ability, the mindset, so they can help change that society. Right? That is that education cannot merely reproduce. It's got to give children the creativity, the critical thinking skills, problem-solving ability, because they're going to inherit a whole bunch of problems. Right? We've already heard a lot about this today, and the projections are that within the next 10 years, there'll be 1 billion people moving across the world. And the pattern typically is from poor areas to rich areas, even within countries. We know that inequality is rising, not just in the United States, but throughout the world. This is a major factor producing some of the movement of people. And we know that global warming is real, like it or not. It's here to stay, and it's part of our future. And so the question is, what role does education play in helping us respond to that kind of future, given the rise in xenophobia, given the resentments that are accompanying these changes? I think that as educators, if we don't grapple with these issues, then we will make ourselves irrelevant. And sadly, I think that many of our systems have become irrelevant, and the children show it, exhibit it in their lack of engagement, their lack of inspiration. Ask children, how often at the end of the day are you inspired by what you've learned? Right? And I would think most of us not be happy with what we hear. So we've already seen this graphic. I want you to think now about the barriers. What are the barriers to equity? Okay? And in my own work, what I find consistently is the barriers are unequal access in resources. They are a deficit orientation toward the culture of the marginalized group. That is, education is almost always fixated with assimilating those who are different, which usually means eradicating their language and culture. It's about, therefore, we don't treat their parents as partners in the process. We don't build the capacity of schools, which exacerbates the inequity issues. And finally, the policies that we've adopted create real constraints. So good practice is occurring in spite of policy, not because of policy, in too many places. In this country especially, we expect schools to solve a whole myriad of problems that go well beyond education. And consequently, the schools that are serving children with the greatest needs are the schools that are struggling. In Vermont, where I was this summer, the #1 equity issue that principals in Vermont wanted to talk about was the opioid crisis. One school alone sent 53 children to foster care in 1 month because their parents had been arrested and were not able to take care of their children. This is in a predominantly white state that is more affluent than most, and this is what they're dealing with. And so we cannot expect schools to respond to these issues. So what we've got to do, and this is why I raised the point about positive deviance, is look at the schools that are figuring it out. And what are they doing differently? So here's an example of such a school in the South Bronx, a school that serves recent immigrants. Many of them are not children who went to school regularly in their native country, which means they're not literate in their native language. In most places, these children would drop out in droves because it takes too long to master academic English. This is a school with a 95% graduation rate. And because 40% of the children are undocumented and therefore can't go to college, they make sure they get technical skills so they can work. Right? When I asked the children what makes a school like this work, they said, we feel like a family. We feel supported. When I asked teachers what makes it possible for so many teachers, and 1/3 of their teachers are new, to be successful, it's because we never plan alone. We always plan our lessons collectively and get feedback before we administer a lesson. Similarly, here's a school that was started with explicit commitment to counter the violence, to counter the school-to-prison pipeline, to counter the death in the South Bronx. This is a school that is serving mostly black and Latino males. He started the school with the explicit focus, how do I create a school that's more powerful in the streets? And how do you counter gangs? How do you counter violence? Well, you create a school that's so compelling that children want to be there. And you provide them with access to mentors that can provide the support they need. So when we start to look at these kinds of schools, what we start to realize is that you can make changes without waiting for permission. Right? And I think that's part of what we've got to encourage, or at least allow to happen in more places, is for educators to have the chance to promote agency in children, and I would say not just in children, but in teachers as well, because agency can be collective. We have to figure out how to foster more creativity in the classroom, which means that we can't simply focus on preparing kids for tests, but we have to give them the chance to apply what they've learned. Visiting a school in the South Bronx, again, coldest day of the year, students are studying the Bronx River, collecting samples in their chemistry class because they want to know what are the pollutants in that river, how do they take what they've learned to figure out how to create a healthier environment. These are kids, and I asked the chemistry teacher, why are they learning that in a chemistry class? She said, because my goal is not to have them pass the test. My goal is for some of these children to become scientists who will be able to have an impact on their community where they live. And then finally, we have to build social capital. And social capital is really just a way of talking about bonds of solidarity that cut across differences that allow communities that are vulnerable to have more support to address some of the challenges they face. And when that happens, I think great change is possible. I don't have time to talk about this, but I would say that right now, we've been mentioned the idea of a paradigm shift several times. We've been dominated by a narrow paradigm, which sees achievement in a vacuum, right, and ignores the need to get children motivated, inspired in school. We treat parents as consumers, not as partners. We think pressure is an effective way to improve schools rather than building capacity. And I'd say it's when we make these kinds of shifts that we're going to start to see greater change. Finally, I'd say it's all about asking the right questions. And we've been asking the wrong questions in education for too long. And it's amazing what happens when we shift the focus. Instead of how to raise achievement, to how to get kids motivated and excited about learning. I sat with the principal here in Los Angeles. This is the only school in Los Angeles where students evaluate their teachers. It has the 4th highest graduation rate despite being all poor, all Latino, most of the children English learners. And I asked the principal, I said, how do you motivate kids? He said, we don't motivate them with fear. We motivate them with hope. Right? I would say instead of holding teachers accountable, we should be asking how do we hold all the stakeholders accountable, right? Responsible for what they bring. And then finally, instead of how do we close the achievement gap, which we claim to be so focused on, how do we create schools where a child's background doesn't predict how well they will do? Right. I think when we pose different questions, we end up with different schools. Finally, to speak to Ken's point about transformation, I know from my own work with educators throughout the country and in various parts of the world, it's hard to get people to imagine something new when they're locked into what they know. And so rather than simply putting transformation out there, I would say, how do we get innovation within the systems that we have now that begin to create schools that are more humane, that are more inspiring for children, that are more supportive of the communities that they serve. And I think that my experience has told me that when we ask those kinds of questions, the change is, in fact, very likely.